Hello and welcome to the State of the Fleet Industry, a weekly video series produced by Automotive Fleet magazine and which is sponsored by Enterprise Fleet Management. I'm Mike Antich, editor of Automotive Fleet, and today I'd like to examine what's occurring in the fleet industry for the week of June 7th, 2021. And for this week's report, I'd like to focus on total miles driven industry-wide as a benchmark to gauge the vitality and, more importantly, the recovery of the fleet industry to its pre-pandemic levels of activity. And as we start a new month, we now have new data available to us for the entire month of May 2021. So with this new data in hand, let's benchmark the months of February, March, April, and May 2021 against the same 4 months in calendar year 2020, which was the onset of the pandemic. And the purpose of this comparison is to assess how the fleet industry is moving towards returning to its pre-pandemic levels of fleet activity. And in my mind, total miles driven is really the gold standard when it comes to assessing the vitality of the commercial fleet market. And when you think about it, fleet by its very nature involves the use of mobile assets, namely our vehicles, to fulfill a variety of business functions. And fleet miles driven is a good indicator on the health of a company's core business because fleet, for the most part, is just simply a tool designed to service and grow the core business, whether it's manufacturing, insurance, pharmaceuticals, and so on. So with this in mind, the three best fleet indicators to use as a barometer to gauge the current state of the fleet industry are: one, as I mentioned, total miles driven per month. Two, we're going to examine the number of total fleet trips driven per month. And finally, we'll examine the total fleet miles driven per day by individual fleet vehicles. So these three data sets can be benchmarked against each other and then also against the same time last year to provide a very accurate assessment on fleet activity and fleet vitality and where it is trending. So let's start with our first chart and examine total miles driven. And as you can see on your computer screen, this chart compares total miles driven over 4 months in calendar year 2021 against the same 4 months in calendar year 2020. And the data displayed is provided by Geotab, a telematics reseller that is partnered with Enterprise Fleet Management. And this is an important benchmark because February 2020 was the last month of normal fleet activity prior to the start of the pandemic. And this is shown in the blue bar in the far left-hand corner of your computer screen. And it shows that the total fleet miles driven in February 2020 was 1.3 billion miles. So consequently, the February 2020 fleet data is really our baseline benchmark to gauge how much fleet activity declined since the official start of the pandemic in March 2020. And likewise, it's our baseline for comparing this data against 2021 fleet data to see the fleet industry's rate of recovery. And it's important to stress this is real world, real time, actual fleet data captured by onboard vehicle telematic devices. And these aren't extrapolated data projections, but actual fleet miles driven. And this aggregated and anonymized fleet data of total miles driven provides a very accurate snapshot on the vitality of the fleet industry in total. So let's take a deeper look at this aggregated and anonymized data by examining the total number of miles driven during February, March, April, and May 2021, as shown on the 4 bars on the right-hand side of your screen. So for explanation, February is the blue bar, March is the red bar, April is green, and the month of May is the orange bar. And each bar represents the total fleet miles driven for each of these months. And in the same chart, we can also compare total monthly fleet miles driven against the same 4 months the year prior, namely calendar year 2020, which are the 4 bars on the far left-hand side of your computer screen. So when examining these data sets side by side, it appears at first glance that the total fleet miles driven in May 2021 decreased relative to April 2021. And the question is why? So let's examine this anomaly from another perspective and display a new chart that identifies the total number of fleet miles or total number of fleet trips taken by month. And this chart is also based on anonymized and aggregated fleet data provided by Geotab. And as you can see from this new chart now displayed on your computer screen, we see the same decline in fleet activity in May 2021 when we examine the total number of fleet trips taken by individual fleet vehicles during these 4 months in 2021. And the color coding for each month remains the same. The blue bar representing February, red is March, green is April, and May is orange. And the four bars on the right, far right, represent calendar years 2021, while the four bars on the far left represent calendar years 2020. So upon analyzing this different data set, the same decline appears when you compare May 21 to April 2021. So the decline isn't an anomaly, but why is it occurring? And according to Geotab, the culprit is the Memorial holiday, which created one less business day. And altogether, the month of May had a total of 20 business days, which is fewer business days than either March and April. So for example, the month of March 2021 had 23 business days compared to just 20 business days in May. And likewise, the month of April 2021 had 22 business days, and this compares to just 20 days in May 2021. So the impact on fleet activity by having a fewer number of business days in a month can be best illustrated in this next chart that identifies fleet miles driven per day, which is also data provided by Geotab. So displayed on your screen is another new chart that illustrates the total number of fleet miles driven per day. And the format of this chart is identical to the two prior charts. The four bars in the far right represent 2021 data, and the four bars on the left represent 2020 data. So when you're looking at a single day metric, you can see that the fleet miles per day for the months of March 2021 and April 2021 are about the same. And likewise, when you remove the Memorial Day holiday from the May 2021 average, total fleet miles driven per day look a lot like the total daily fleet miles driven in March and April of 2021. So this explains the anomaly with the May data, but it also shows that we as an industry aren't backsliding. However, and this is an important however, this data also doesn't show dramatic growth in daily business miles driven by fleets. And anecdotally, we see the economy opening up all around us. You know, we see more cars on the road. We see parking lots at both businesses and retail centers full. But from a fleet perspective, it appears that there's been only marginal improvement in fleet activity, at least month over month, and at least so far in the 2021 calendar year. And this is an important point, at least in my mind. You know, examining this data shows that there hasn't been dramatic growth in fleet activity, at least not using these fleet metrics. And fleet is not in a V-shaped recovery. Now, don't get me wrong, fleet activity is recovering, but at a much slower pace than I would have anticipated as recently as the fourth quarter of 2020. I mean, I would have predicted a much higher rate of activity growth. So what we'll have to do is we'll just have to sit tight. We'll have to wait until the beginning of July when the June 2021 fleet mileage numbers are available to see if this status quo month over month activity is the trend and whether this pace is going to continue or whether there's going to be a greater spurt in fleet activity. And the hope is for the latter. So until then, I'd like to conclude my State of the Fleet Industry presentation for June 7th, 2021, and I'd like to thank you for listening.